He never saw it coming. And honestly, I never planned for it to go that far. But when a man looks you in the eye and tells you that you couldn't possibly understand his world, sometimes the only honest response is to let him find out exactly whose world he's standing in. My name is Walter Kowalski. I'm 63 years old. I was born in Thunder Bay, Ontario, to a Polish immigrant father who worked the grain elevators and a mother who cleaned houses on the north side of town 3 days a week. We weren't poor in the way that breaks people. We were poor in the way that teaches them. My father's hands were so rough by the time I was 10 years old that when he shook mine before I left for my first day of high school, it felt like gripping the bark of a birch tree. He never complained about it. Not once. He used to say that the calluses on a working man's hands were the most honest autobiography a person could write. I carried that with me for 40 years. I spent my 20s swinging a hammer on residential builds across northwestern Ontario. By 30, I had my journeyman's ticket and a small crew of 3 men who trusted me enough to follow me from site to site. By 40, I had incorporated my first company, Kowalski General Contracting, and we were pulling contracts on commercial developments across the province. I wasn't flashy about it. I drove the same kind of truck I'd always driven. I wore the same kind of work boots. I kept my office above a hardware store in a strip mall outside of Sudbury because the rent was reasonable and I didn't need anyone to be impressed by my address. By the time I turned 60, Kowalski Construction Group had grown into something my father would have had trouble believing if I'd tried to explain it to him. We operated across 4 provinces. We had stake in 17 active development projects. I employed just over 400 people directly, and another 200 through subcontracting arrangements. We had completed 3 major public infrastructure contracts for the federal government and 1 hospital expansion in northern Ontario that I'm still proud of every time I drive past it. But I still drove the same kind of truck, still wore the same kind of boots. My son, Danny, is 31. He's a good man. He has his mother's patience and, God help him, my stubbornness. He met his fiancée, Claire, at a continuing education program through the University of Toronto about 4 years ago. Claire is sharp, warm, and she makes Danny laugh in a way I hadn't seen from him since he was a teenager. I liked her immediately. I liked even more that she was clearly her own person. She had opinions, she held on to them, and she didn't shift them just to keep the peace. That kind of character is worth more than most things I can name. The engagement had been announced the previous autumn. The wedding was set for July, out at a property just east of Collingwood. Claire's family was from the Oakville area, old money. The kind that doesn't talk about itself too loudly, but makes sure you notice it eventually. Her father's name was Reginald Ashworth. He was 67, semi-retired, and had spent most of his career as a senior partner at a Bay Street investment firm. The kind of man who knew the right restaurants, the right clubs, the right people. He had that particular polish that comes not from effort but from never having had to try very hard at anything that mattered to him. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it as an observation. There are men who are built by difficulty and men who are built by ease, and you can usually tell them apart within the first 10 minutes of a conversation. I could tell with Reginald within the first 3. The rehearsal dinner was held on a Thursday evening in late June, at a private dining room in a restaurant near Collingwood that I was told had a 2-month wait for reservations. The drive up from Sudbury had taken me about 3.5 hours. I arrived in my truck, parked it in the lot between a Mercedes and a Range Rover, and walked in wearing dress pants, a collared shirt, and the blazer my daughter-in-law Margaret had bought me for Danny's university graduation. It was a good blazer, but I'll admit it had been pressed into service more often than it probably should have been without a visit to the dry cleaner. Claire's family was already gathered when I arrived. There were perhaps 20 people in the room, Claire's parents, her 2 brothers and their wives, several family friends, and a few of Danny and Claire's mutual friends from the city. Danny was at the far end of the room talking to one of Claire's brothers, and he caught my eye immediately and crossed over to greet me. "You made it," he said, and he hugged me the way he'd been hugging me since he was small with his whole self, not just his arms. Said I would, I told him. Claire came over and kissed my cheek, and I told her she looked beautiful, because she did. She introduced me to her mother, Patricia, who was gracious and warm, and then to her father. Reginald Ashworth had the kind of handshake that tells you everything. Firm enough to be technically acceptable, brief enough to communicate that the gesture was a formality rather than a greeting. He looked at me with that particular expression I have seen on certain kinds of men my whole life, the quick scan, top to bottom, the small recalibration behind the eyes when they decide what category to put you in. "Walter," he said, "good of you to make the drive." "Wouldn't have missed it," I said. "Long way from Sudbury," he said, with a small smile that wasn't quite a smile. "About what I expected," I said. We were seated for dinner not long after. I was placed across the table from Reginald, with Patricia to his left and one of Claire's brothers, a man named Sebastian, to his right. Danny was 3 seats down, deep in conversation with Claire's younger brother and his wife. The evening started pleasantly enough. The food was excellent. The wine was good. Patricia asked me about Sudbury with what seemed like genuine interest, and I told her a bit about the city, about the changes I'd seen in 40 years, about the way the land up there gets into you if you let it. She listened carefully. She was a good listener. Reginald was quieter through the appetizers. He contributed to the table conversation in a measured, occasional way, a comment here, a name dropped there. I got the sense he was a man accustomed to holding the room without appearing to try. It was during the main course that things began to shift. The conversation had moved to the topic of the young couple's plans after the wedding. They were going to spend 2 weeks in Portugal, then come back and begin the process of looking for a house in the annex neighborhood in Toronto. Reginald made a remark about the market, about how property in certain parts of the city had become complicated, and I agreed that the last decade had changed things significantly from a development perspective. He looked at me with mild curiosity. "You follow the development market?" "In a way," I said. He smiled, that same thin smile from earlier. "It's quite specialized," he said. "The commercial development side, especially. I've sat on a few investment committees that have looked at projects in that space. It's a particular kind of world, very much about relationships and positioning, not always easy to understand from the outside." "I imagine not," I said. I let it sit there. I didn't add anything to it. Danny had glanced over from down the table, and I could see him reading the moment with that alertness he'd had since he was a boy. Patricia asked Sebastian something about his work, and the conversation shifted for a few minutes. I spoke with the woman to my left, a friend of Claire's family named Helen, who turned out to be a retired schoolteacher from Burlington, with a quick wit and very firm opinions about the state of public infrastructure, which I found refreshing. Then Reginald turned back to me. "What line of work are you in, Walter?" he asked, with the air of a man asking a question he'd already answered for himself. "Construction," I said. He nodded slowly. In that particular way, that means a person is confirming a conclusion they'd already reached. "Residential?" "Started there," I said. "Expanded over the years." "Right," he said. He picked up his wineglass. "It's solid, honest work. The trades have been crucial through all of this growth. I mean that sincerely. Where would the city be without the people willing to do that kind of work, right?" I said I agreed with him. "Danny mentioned your company," he said. "Kowalski something." "Kowalski Construction Group," I said. "Right." He set his glass down. "He's very proud of you. That's clear. He said it the way you'd compliment a child's drawing. It must be a good feeling, building something like that. A local operation." "It keeps me busy," I said. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "You know, Claire's future, what she steps into with Danny, it's something Patricia and I take seriously. I'm sure you understand. The world she's been raised in, the kind of life she's accustomed to, the circles she's moved in, it takes a certain kind of foundation. Not everyone appreciates what that means." He paused. "No offense intended, of course. It's just a different world. You wouldn't necessarily understand all of what goes into maintaining that kind of life." The table was still loud with other conversations. Only Patricia, Sebastian, and Helen were close enough to have heard him clearly. Patricia looked down at her plate. Sebastian looked at his father with an expression I couldn't entirely read. I set my fork down. I looked at Reginald Ashworth across the table, and I let the silence stretch for just a moment. Not long enough to be rude. Long enough to be deliberate. "You might be right," I said. "I'm not sure I fully understand that world." He nodded, satisfied. "I do understand some things, though," I continued, keeping my voice easy, conversational. "I understand what it means to build something from a job site in northwestern Ontario with 3 men and a used loader. I understand federal procurement processes pretty well. We've completed 3 infrastructure contracts for the government in the last 12 years. I understand collective agreements across 4 provinces, because we employ just over 400 people directly, and keeping them working and taken care of is the part of this I care about most. I reached for my water glass. I understand commercial development well enough that we currently have a stake in 17 active projects. One of them, as it happens, is a mixed-use development in the east end of Oakville. I believe the investment committee review for the anchor financing came across someone's desk at Meridian Capital about 8 months ago. Reginald's expression had changed. The satisfied look was gone. In its place was something careful, recalculating. I knew about Meridian Capital because Meridian Capital was one of 3 investment firms that had submitted letters of intent to co-finance our Oakville project, the largest single development Kowalski Construction Group had ever undertaken, with a projected value upon completion that would have made the number uncomfortable to say in polite dinner conversation. The senior partner at Meridian, who had personally reached out to us to express interest, was a man named Gerald Ashworth, Reginald's younger brother. I hadn't brought it up before dinner. I hadn't planned to bring it up at all, if I'm being truthful. I had come to this dinner as Danny's father, not as the principal of a construction group. I had no interest in making an entrance or establishing a position. I was there because my son was getting married to a woman I genuinely liked, and I wanted to be present for that. But there are moments when a man leaves you no dignified choice but to tell him the truth of where he is standing. Sebastian was looking at me with an expression that had moved from unreadable to something very close to amusement. Patricia had looked up from her plate. Reginald cleared his throat. Gerald mentioned he started, then stopped. He mentioned the Oakville project, the Kowalski Group. Good project, I said. We're proud of it. I didn't, he paused. I wasn't aware that you were. No reason you would be, I said, and I meant it without edge. I didn't come here tonight to talk about work. I came because Danny is my son and Claire is going to be my daughter-in-law, and I'm very glad about both of those things. Patricia set her hand briefly on Reginald's arm. It was a small gesture, a quiet one, but I noticed it. The conversation moved on. The rest of dinner passed in a different register than the first half had. Reginald spoke to me twice more before the evening ended, once to ask a genuine question about the Collingwood region's development patterns, and once to say that he hoped we'd have the chance to talk more properly before the wedding. Both times, he looked at me when he spoke, not through me, not past me, at me. I drove back to my hotel that night along the dark highway, with the windows cracked and the radio off. I thought about my father's hands. I thought about Danny's face during dinner, that watchful alertness I'd seen from down the table. I thought about Claire, who had come to find me before I left the restaurant, and had hugged me and whispered that she was sorry, and I had told her she had nothing at all to be sorry about, and I had meant it completely. The wedding was 6 weeks later. It was a clear afternoon, the kind of July day that southern Ontario occasionally produces, as if to remind you why people have always wanted to live near the water. The ceremony was in a field of long grass with a view of Georgian Bay in the distance, and when Danny stood at the end of that aisle and watched Claire walk toward him, his face did something that I will not try to describe because I wouldn't do it justice. I will only say that I was not the only one in that field who had to look away for a moment. At the reception, Reginald gave a speech. It was polished and warm, as you'd expect. He talked about Claire growing up, about the values he and Patricia had tried to give her, about welcoming Danny into the family. Then, near the end, he paused in the way speakers do when they're about to say something they haven't fully rehearsed. I want to say something about Walter, he said, Danny's father. I was at the table nearest the small riser they were using as a stage. I looked up. I made an assumption at the rehearsal dinner, Reginald said, looking at me directly. It was the kind of assumption I'm not proud of. Walter had every right to correct me in a way that would have been embarrassing, and he chose not to. He paused. He let me find my own way to the truth of it, and he did it with more grace than I deserved. He raised his glass. To Walter, and to what we might all learn from a man who never once needed the room to know who he was. There were perhaps 120 people in that reception tent. They raised their glasses. Danny caught my eye from the head table and gave me a look that said everything. I raised my glass back at Reginald, and I nodded, and that was all that needed to happen. In the months that followed, I saw Reginald several times at Christmas, at a dinner Patricia organized in the new year, once when he and Danny drove up to one of our Oakville site walkthroughs, which Reginald had asked to attend out of what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than due diligence. He was different in those conversations, still polished, still comfortable with himself, but listening more than he performed. Patricia told Claire privately, and Claire told Danny. And Danny told me with a grin that Reginald had said I was the most interesting man he hadn't expected to meet. Gerald Ashworth, his brother, did eventually come on board as part of the Oakville financing consortium. We had a good working relationship. He was nothing like his brother in his first impression of people, and we got along well from the start. The Oakville project broke ground the following spring. It will be finished, if everything goes to schedule, in about 2.5 years. 400 residential units, ground floor commercial space, and a small public park along the waterfront that we insisted on, including even when the numbers made it uncomfortable. Some things are worth the cost. I've been thinking lately about what my father used to say, not just about the Callises, but about something else he told me once, when I was about 17 and had come home frustrated after a foreman on a summer job had dismissed me in front of the rest of the crew. I remember standing in the kitchen, jaw tight, wanting badly to say I was angry without wanting to admit it. My father was sitting at the table with his tea. He looked at me for a long moment. "Walter," he said, "a man who needs you to know who he is not yet sure himself. But a man who knows who he can afford to wait." I was 17. I filed it away without fully understanding it. I think about it often now, about what it costs to insist on being seen, and what it frees you from when you don't need to. About how the quietest form of confidence is the kind that doesn't require an audience. About the difference between a man who wears his worth on his chest like a nameplate and a man who carries it in his hands, in the work, in the 400 families who go home on a Friday with something earned. Reginald Ashworth was not a bad man. I want to be clear about that. He was a man who had moved through a life that had mostly confirmed what he already believed about the nature of things, and he had never been given sufficient reason to question it. That is a more common condition than most of us want to admit, and it is one I cannot claim to be entirely free of myself. We all carry the shape of the world we were raised in. The question is whether we're willing to let that shape be changed by what we encounter, or whether we insist on making everything we encounter fit the shape we already have. He chose to let it change. That choice, made publicly and at a cost to his own pride, told me more about his actual character than the condescension at dinner ever could. Danny and Claire are expecting their first child in the spring. They've bought a house not in the annex, as it turned out, but further east, a neighborhood they walked through one October afternoon and fell in love with, for reasons neither of them could quite articulate, which is the right reason to fall in love with a neighborhood. I drove down to see the house the weekend after they got the keys. It was a Saturday morning, cold and bright the way October gets in Ontario when it means it. Danny met me at the front door and walked me through every room, pointing out what they planned to fix, what they wanted to keep, where they thought the baby's room would go. He had his grandfather's manner of assessing a space. I noticed standing in the middle of a room and turning slowly, measuring things with his eyes before he said anything. We stood in the backyard after, looking at the fence that needed work and the tree that would need attention in the spring. "The fence isn't bad," I said. "Week's work, maybe 2. "I was hoping you'd say that," Danny said. "I'll come down in November," I said. "We'll do it right." He nodded. Then he was quiet for a moment. The way he gets when something is sitting in him that he's deciding whether to say. "At the rehearsal dinner," he said finally. "I saw it. What he said to you." "I know you did," I said. I wanted to say something. "I know that too." He looked at me. "Why didn't you? Right then, I mean. You could have." I thought about it. About the 100 ways I could have answered Reginald Ashworth across that dinner table and chosen not to. "Because it wasn't about winning the evening," I said, "and because Claire loves her father, and because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all, until the moment when saying something actually matters." Danny was quiet for a while. "Grandpa," he said, not as a question, just the word. "Your grandpa," I said. We stood there in the backyard of his new house until the cold got serious, and then we went inside and made coffee, and his wife came home from an errand with groceries and a story about a parking situation that had her laughing before she got through the door, and the afternoon became what good afternoons become when you stop trying to make them into anything. Later, driving back north on the 400, the highway opening up past Barrie into the long, quiet stretch that always feels to me like the province finally breathing, I found myself thinking about what gets passed down and what gets lost. About the things a father gives a son that have no name for them, not money, not advice, not even example exactly, but something more like atmosphere. the way a person moves through difficulty, the way they hold themselves when they're being measured and they know it, the way they decide, in the quiet of themselves, what they're going to be about. My father gave me that, not in a speech, not in a lesson, in 40 years of watching him pick up his lunch pail and go. I hope I've given some version of it to Danny. I hope he gives some version of it to the child who is coming. I hope that child grows up knowing that the most valuable things a person carries rarely show on the outside, that the world will make its assessments quickly and often wrongly, and that the correct response to being underestimated is not anger, not performance, but patience, the deep, steady patience of a person who already knows the truth of themselves and is content to let it come out in its own time. That is a lesson no address can give you. No club membership, no investment portfolio, no restaurant with a 2-month wait for a table. It comes from somewhere older than any of that. It comes from a father's hands, rough as birch bark, holding yours on the first day of something new. That is the only inheritance that matters.